Since the early 1970s, Muslim countries individually or collectively under the Organization of Islamic Countries, or OIC, had called on the Philippines to resolve the Moro conflict through negotiations, with the OIC foreign ministers many times sending fact-finding and mediation teams to Mindanao for this purpose. For the Philippine government, a negotiated settlement was its only option because by 1975, the Muslim rebellion had greatly expanded, with the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF, boasting some 60,000 fighters and having gained international support and recognition through the OIC. Even more pressing, tens of thousands of Moro and Christian civilians had lost their lives and up to 1 million residents displaced by the fighting, with some 200,000 Moros fleeing as refugees to Malaysia. Some 80% of the Philippines' military strength was allocated to Mindanao. The war's economic toll was rising, and the Philippines now risked facing sanctions from its Middle Eastern oil suppliers. Under mediation efforts by the OIC, in December 1976, the Philippine government and the MNLF signed a Tripoli Agreement, where the MNLF, under strong pressure from the OIC, agreed to drop its demand for independence and instead agreed to Muslim autonomy within the sovereignty of the Philippines. The OIC determined that the Muslim rebellion was an internal matter to the Philippines. The Tripoli Agreement contained the crucial stipulation that the Muslim autonomous region must be brought before the Philippines' constitutional process. In this case, the Philippine government called for the holding of a plebiscite. This stipulation in the Tripoli Agreement would prove to be the source of bitter contention between the Philippine government and the MNLF, which ultimately would lead to the failure of the Tripoli Agreement. The dispute regarding the stipulation of holding a plebiscite led to follow-up OIC-brokered negotiations in February 1977, where MLF leader Miswari reverted to demanding for Muslim independence, as a plebiscite would almost certainly reject autonomy, since the demographics in the proposed Muslim autonomous region contained a majority Christian population, outnumbering the Muslims by a 2-to-1 ratio, and a 3-to-1 margin if including the indigenous tribes, which, like the Christians, did not want to be placed under MNLF rule. Miswari had insisted that Christians should not be allowed to vote in the plebiscite, saying that they were not the original inhabitants of Mindanao, a view that was rejected by the government. In March 1977, the Philippine government set up 2 separate regional autonomous governments, although the Tripoli Agreement had stipulated only one, and offered a number of positions to Miswari and other MLF officers, which were all turned down. Then, in a multi-question plebiscite held in April 1977, as expected, the affected residents overwhelmingly rejected, at 98% of the votes, 1. The proposed Muslim autonomous region, and 2. Being governed by the MNLF. Miswari had campaigned against the holding of the plebiscite and urged its boycott, and denounced the government as insincere and deceitful for not complying with the provision in the Tripoli Agreement of a single Muslim autonomous region. In the wake of the results of the plebiscite, Miswari rejected autonomy altogether and reverted to demanding for Moro independence upon returning to the jungles to restart hostilities. Fighting restarted and escalated with renewed intensity, the most serious incident being the Pata Island massacre in February 1981, where government troops patrolling Pata Island were set upon by the MNLF, inflicting the largest number of government losses in a single incident during the war. In reprisal, government forces bombarded Pata Island for many months, causing thousands of civilian casualties. In 1987, 1 year after a popular uprising toppled the authoritarian regime, the new government implemented a policy of reconciliation with the MNLF, which led in January 1987 to the signing of the Jeddah Accord, which had the following stipulations: a ceasefire, the MNLF relinquishing its demand for independence and agreeing to Muslim autonomy, and for both sides working toward creating an autonomous region. In August 1989, the Philippine government established the Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao, or ARMM, the scope of this autonomous territory being eventually decided by a plebiscite held in November 1989. The MNLF again opposed the holding of a plebiscite, repeating its earlier demand from the 1977 plebiscite that the government must simply implement the 1976 Tripoli Agreement of a Muslim autonomous region covering Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan. As in the 1977 plebiscite, the 1989 plebiscite showed that an overwhelming majority of voters in Christian provinces rejected joining the autonomous region, while Muslim-majority provinces opted for membership. Consequently, Miswari and the MNLF again rejected the results of the plebiscite and returned to the jungles to renew armed struggle. Then in 1993, with mediation efforts by the OIC, Libya, and Indonesia, the Philippine government and the MNLF restarted peace talks that led to both sides agreeing to a ceasefire, and after more negotiations, to the signing in September 1996 of the Jakarta Accord, which ended the over 2 decades-long war between the Philippine government and the MNLF, and whose stipulations included an expanded ARMM government tasked with implementing social and infrastructure development of the region, enticing foreign investments, and integrating MNLF fighters into the Philippines military and police forces. Then in elections held in September 1996, Miswari ran and won unopposed as ARMM governor, which was a crucial juncture in the Muslim insurgency, as Miswari was now, at least nominally, on the side of the government. Still, peace remained elusive, since the Jakarta Accord produced a new set of problems. The once monolithic MNLF had by this time broken up into many factions, and some of these factions opposed the MNLF deal, believing that the Jakarta Accord had given too much concessions to the Philippine government. Ultimately, some 50% of the MNLF fighters were integrated into the country's security forces, which critically weakened the MNLF's armed strength. More crucially for the ARMM, Miswari's government was rife with corruption, nepotism, favoritism, and an oversized bureaucracy, and was thus extremely unpopular with the Moros. In dissatisfaction with Miswari's governorship, top MNLF leaders stripped Miswari of all his posts in the MNLF, a move that was supported by the OIC. In 2001, Miswari, sensing likely defeat at re-election in the upcoming elections, abandoned the ARMM governorship altogether, and in November 2001, launched an armed rebellion in Sulu. Government forces quelled the uprising and arrested and jailed Miswari, but later released him in 2008. However, by then, the MNLF had ceased to be the vanguard of the Muslim insurgency, and the Philippine government was now focused on another, more powerful armed group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF. Earlier in 1977, a group of top MNLF officers attempted to depose Miswari as chairman of the organization for a number of reasons. 1. They disapproved of Miswari's autocratic leadership. 2. They disagreed with Miswari over the recently failed MNLF negotiations with the Philippine government regarding the Tripoli Agreement. And 3. They believed that Miswari was turning the MNLF toward adopting Marxism-Leninism. The coup failed and the mutineers were expelled, who then formed their own rebel organization called the New MNLF. Another factor in the split may have been the historical rivalry and hostility among Moro ethnic groups. In this case, Miswari was Tausug, and the dissenters were Maranaos and Maguindanaos. Muslim countries through the OIC continue to recognize Miswari and the MNLF as a legitimate representative of Filipino Muslims, relegating the new MNLF to a minor role, whose actions during the 1980s consisted mainly of terrorist acts such as bombings and grenade attacks. In 1984, the new MNLF was renamed as the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, the word Islamic denoting the group's emphasis toward adopting Sharia law and the use of the Quran. The MILF's strength rose exponentially during the 1990s as a result of the unpopularity of the MNLF-led ARMM, and especially with the 1996 Jakarta Accord, where Miswari became the ARMM governor, with his leadership mired with charges of corruption and gross mismanagement, and the MNLF weakened after 50% of its fighters were integrated into the Philippine security forces. In 1997, the Philippine government signed a ceasefire with the MILF and adopted a policy of non-confrontation with Moro rebels to encourage peace talks, which allowed the MILF to gain de facto control of large Muslim areas in central and western Mindanao, where it established Islamic quasi-governments that strictly enforced Sharia law, complete with mosques and Islamic schools, as well as numerous rebel bases with an arms factory to augment weapons sourced from Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 1999, the MILF, now boasting some 16,000 fighters, formed the Special Operations Group, a terrorist militia that carried out bombings and other violent acts. Abduction of an Italian priest in Mindanao. Abduction of another Italian priest. Seizing and occupying 2 town halls. Bombing of a passenger ferry. Consequently, in 2000, the Philippine government, now under a hardline president, declared all-out war on the MILF, and the military launched a powerful 3-month offensive from March to July 2000 that gravely weakened the MILF, with 1,100 rebels killed and 45 camps and logistical and communication systems destroyed, and more crucially, former rebel-occupied territories were returned to government control. Some 400 civilians perished in the fighting, and up to 1 million people were displaced. In December 2000, other Moro armed groups retaliated with bombing attacks in many areas in Manila, causing hundreds of civilian casualties. But just a year later, in March 2001, the new government, in a complete reversal of policy, announced all-out peace with the MILF in the spirit of reconciliation, and negotiations soon began. Since 1987, the Philippine government had held on and off negotiations with the MILF that continued into the 1990s, which ultimately led to the signing of a ceasefire in 1997. However, tensions and distrust remained, particularly because of the MILF's terrorist activities. Peace negotiations were greatly boosted when the Philippine government prevailed upon the United States not to designate the MILF as a terrorist organization in the wake of the September 11 attacks. And in 2003, the MILF finally renounced the use of terror and disassociated itself with terrorist organizations, and declared its commitment to uphold the 1997 ceasefire agreement with the Philippine government. By then, the MILF had dropped its demand for an independent Islamic state and agreed to Muslim autonomy within the sovereignty of the Philippines. In 2010, the Philippine government moved to create a new Moro Autonomous Administration, stating that the current ex-MNLF-led ARMM was a failed experiment. Over the years, the ARMM enjoyed large infusions of government money for its development, but suffered from corruption and gross mismanagement, and the region continued to have the country's lowest rates of literacy, per capita income, and life expectancy. In agreements signed in 2012 and 2014, the Philippine government and the MILF agreed to the creation of a new Muslim Autonomous Administration called Bangsamoro. And in January 2014, under mediation efforts by Malaysia and other Muslim countries under the OIC, both sides signed a peace agreement which ended nearly 4 decades of war. Meanwhile, Miswari and the MNLF had long stated their opposition to the negotiations between the Philippine government and the MILF, stating that their own 1996 agreement with the government had settled the status of Muslims. Consequently, in July 2013 in Sulu, Miswari proclaimed the independence of the Bangsamoro Republic, which was ignored by the Philippine government. In September 2013, an armed MNLF group, perhaps under the orders of Miswari, attacked Zamboanga, leading to a siege of the city, where government forces prevailed after 2 weeks of heavy fighting. The rebels were expelled, suffering 800 casualties, but leaving the city destroyed, with 120,000 civilians displaced and tens of thousands of homes gutted by fire. Another setback to the government-MILF negotiations occurred in January 2015 in the so-called Mama Sapano clash, where an accidental gun battle between government forces and several Moro armed groups, including the MILF, caused heavy casualties to both sides. However, both the government and the MILF remained committed to peaceful resolution. And in July 2018, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BARMM, was formed, replacing ARMM, with the new autonomous region now led by the MILF, whose 30,000 fighters and the MILF organization itself were agreed to be decommissioned. Both sides agreed that the Philippines will remain as one nation, with the national government continuing to hold exclusive powers of sovereignty, defense and security, foreign policy and citizenship.